The race is on, and it's time for the first in a new regular series of episodes where we talk driver rankings after each Grand Prix and take your questions on what I was thinking. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? And what's the methodology used? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to take charge of the grilling is Glenn Freeman. Welcome to the very first of our driver ranking podcasts, all about the Canadian Grand Prix. And joining me as the first in a rotating cast of people who will be my interrogators on behalf of the Race Members Club who have fired questions at me, it's Glenn Freeman. Do you feel privileged, Glenn, to be first up to attack me?
Hugely privileged. Any chance to attack you has to be grabbed with both hands. So I'm looking forward to that. But I'm also looking forward to representing our members. As you mentioned there, they've been questioning you on your rankings and the way you rate the drivers for quite a long time now. But we want to bring it out into the open and have these debates for more people to hear how wrong you are, basically, at every opportunity, Ed.
Yes, well, I give them plenty of opportunity to do that, but it's always interesting to talk through how it works. As this is the first episode that we're doing this, it's probably worth us very, very briefly talking about the methodology, which is, it's a bit of an inexact science because every driver's weekend is a little bit different. Everybody's got different cars, etc. There's different missions. So the main things are it reflects the full weekend performance. So I consider everything, qualifying the race. Qualifying I usually call lap zero of the race. And the reason for that is if I was to qualify on pole and lead from start to finish, and Glenn were to qualify 21st and charge through to second, Glenn has actually had a better race. But you have to factor in qualifying, and I have had the better weekend. That's the sort of principle of it. And you'll consider mistakes, you'll consider underlying speed, you'll consider execution. Mistakes often carry quite a heavy toll for me. So that's the kind of basics.
Yeah, I think as we do a few more of these and other people get to challenge you and take you on in these little duels, people get a better understanding maybe of what to look for and what sort of things can get a driver marked up or down from you. Something I wanted to add is obviously for the last couple of years, we've been doing this as a ranking from top to bottom. I was going to say 1 to 20, but now it's 1 to 22. That moved us away from the old style that we had and you've done for many years where you used to give the drivers a score out of 10. Basically, people like me at this end, at base, who get to make the decisions, wanted to make your life a bit more difficult because it's very easy. Lots of drivers can have a similar level of performance and you could maybe give them all a 7 out of 10 and you have a clutch of drivers where you've not really had to differentiate them. We wanted to challenge you a bit more. We've given you the hellish task of making sure that you literally have to split every single driver, even if it's very difficult to do and even if it feels like some of them have had near identical levels of performance. So I would apologise to you for that, Ed, but for us, I think it makes it more fun.
And it does reflect the fact that the standard at which Grand Prix drivers operate is extremely high. The difference between the best driver on the grid and the worst driver is actually not that big. So very often, if you have it purely on a, say, rating out of 10, you get a lot of people clustered in the middle. There's a lot of sort of 6, 7s, 7.5, 8 out of 10, because they're all doing a very, very good job. And you tend not to use too much the lower reaches because everybody is pretty competent, I would say. Well, everyone is more than competent in F1. So it's often is worth bearing in mind that the difference between, say, P5 and P20 in the list, in terms of actual performance, might, in old money, if you're doing a rating out of 10, be only a couple of marks. That's how clustered things are. So the rankings forces me to decide who I felt was better than everyone, if you like, because that's what it is. It's sort of a process of, what are there, 231 combinations of head-to-head. So it's almost the resolution of that. Was driver X better than driver Y? Yeah, right. Driver X better than driver Z, etc., etc. And you can kind of build it up like that. So that sort of hopefully explains the methodology. But there will be areas in terms of the questions that I'm asked in the discussions that kind of tease out more. And I guess the other thing I'd always say is that it's worth remembering that it's not always hard and fast in that, let's say a mistake, well, there's different levels of mistakes. There's different consequences for mistakes. And although consequence shouldn't necessarily dictate how harshly they're judged, you do have to factor actually in the consequence a little bit, because it's impossible not to. And so it's just worth bearing that in mind, that in one week, a similar mistake might actually hurt your ranking more than in another week if there's certain mitigating factors. So there's a lot of inexact science in this. It is inherently subjective, but I try to be consistent. And always, if you're asking questions, if you sign up to the Race Members Club because you want to get involved, you can hit the link in the episode description to find out more about that. You can always try and pick me up on inconsistencies, and I'll see if I can explain it. So the obvious starting point will be running through the driver rankings themselves. So here's the full rundown from 22 to 1. 22nd, Nico Hülkenberg. 21st, Oscar Piastri. 20th, Valtteri Bottas. 19th, Lance Stroll. 18th, Esteban Ocon. 17th, Gabriel Bortoleto. 16th, Fernando Alonso. 15th, Pierre Gasly. 14th, Ollie Behrman. 13th, Alex Albon. 12th, Isaac Hadjar. 11th, Charles Leclerc. 10th, Sergio Perez. 9th, Liam Lawson. 8th, Carlos Sainz. 7th, Franco Colapinto. 6th, Arvid Lindblad. 5th, Max Verstappen. 4th, Lando Norris. 3rd, Lewis Hamilton. 2nd, Kimi Antonelli. And 1st, George Russell. So, Glenn, where do you want to start? Which members' questions are you going to point in my direction first?
So this was really interesting because I was away this weekend, so I wasn't as close to our kind of work chats and as on the pulse of what you guys are doing as I would normally be. And I found that fascinating for this exercise because I knew I'd be the first person putting these questions to you. And I always try and guess. I know a reasonable amount about your logic, Ed. I always try and guess who you're going to put number one. And I assumed that it would be someone other than the Mercedes drivers because I feel like the top drivers or the drivers in the best cars have to work very hard to convince you that they did the best job over the weekend. So I was kind of asking myself, will it be Lewis Hamilton? Could be Max Verstappen? Might even be Franco Colapinto. I think we're going to talk about all those later. But you actually went for a Mercedes 1-2, as we've heard there. Unfortunately, that generated lots of questions from our members as well. So talking about them as a collective first, we have Russell first and Antonelli second, as you read out there. Stuart Coulter said he was surprised to see the Mercedes drivers at the top, as both made a number of minor errors while under pressure, and he feels you've cut them too much slack. But Robert Chambers says you could have put Kimi and George in any order, but also says kudos to you for keeping them at the top. So I feel like we're starting this off by highlighting one of the issues that regularly comes up when people ask you about this stuff, where you have one person going, how on earth have you put them at the top? And someone else going, yay, you've put them at the top. So it is quite rare, though, I feel, and you may disagree, for the top two who are fighting for the championship in the best car to end up 1-2 in your rankings. And looking back at the numbers for this season, actually, Ed, this is the first time you've put a Mercedes driver number one. So how did we end up with a Mercedes 1-2?
Yeah, in a way, it slightly surprised me because as I worked through the
Surprised
process...
by your own rankings.
Yeah, well, I kind of worked through it and obviously follow what everyone's doing over the weekend, and there's copious notes in my big notebook. And then you kind of get to the point where you've got to start thinking about ordering them. And actually, I was sort of thinking, oh, this is probably one where it's not one of those two. But actually, the more I looked at it, the more I thought about it, the more I considered the nature of their battle. It was absolutely flat out two top drivers pushing each other with the world championship at stake and producing some absolutely fantastic racing. That actually pushed them to the top. That combined with the fact that, as is rightly pointed out, there are a lot of mistakes. But actually, this was a weekend where there were a lot of little mistakes. Pretty much everyone, if you saw through the onboards, the TV production missed a lot of them. But because the tyres were right down at the bottom of the temperature window, there were a lot of lockups, people struggling, having little offs here and there, loads and loads of unseen moments throughout it. So actually, everybody was doing that to a greater or lesser extent. And all the other candidates, they had something where you thought, oh, actually, they underachieved in qualifying. There was this mistake, there was that, there was sort of bigger mistakes. So it kind of came together that put the two Mercedes first and second. And sometimes when you get two drivers really pushing each other onto a higher level, so I think they couldn't cut each other any slack at all. I think that's what elevated it and ended up with them working to P1 and P2. But yeah, it did genuinely surprise me. And even once I'd sort of thought, I think they have to be there, I thought, am I sure? It doesn't quite feel right. But the kind of the reasoning element led me there. And so that's where they stayed.
Yeah, I think people who are new to this format, who may be hearing it in the podcast feed for the first time, who don't usually read the article or put the questions to you, may be thinking, oh, is he always just going to put the guys who run up front at the top of the rankings? I'd say that's incredibly rare, which is why we're starting with it here. But let's talk about the Mercedes drivers individually now. On George Russell, so you're number one, John O'Hara said, I was surprised to see Russell top, and I think it comes down to my interpretation of the measure Ed often uses. This is to use it. You will always talk, Ed, about a driver's mission on a race weekend. People will hear that a lot as they listen to these. And John says, was Russell's mission at this race to be almost as fast as his sophomore teammate? Ben Kelly says, I think you're being slightly kind on Russell, overlooking some errors he made that allowed Antonelli to attack him, while Shrinkinator calls it inexcusable to put Russell first, also citing the fact that his less experienced teammate was quicker than him. So looking at what you wrote, Ed, in your piece, you obviously talked about the fact that actually when it came to the results, until George's car let him down, he kind of did get there when he really needed to. He was maximizing the weekend up to that point. So how do you weigh up that point they've picked up on there that this was meant to be a George Russell stronghold track, and Kimi Antonelli gave him an incredibly hard time and arguably may have had a pace edge over him?
Yeah, well, I think as I said in the piece that I wrote about it, fundamentally, Russell got sprint pole, won the sprint race, got main pole, and was leading the main race, albeit under pressure, when he had a power unit failure that wasn't his fault. So he's kind of done everything, hasn't he? And yeah, there was a feeling that maybe Antonelli, certainly at times, had a bit of a pace edge. He was better at firing the tyres. That was a key thing in particular in the sprint race, where Russell was really struggling with the fronts. But Russell, nonetheless, was still the guy that was doing the leading, doing the winning, wasn't he? So that actually made it pretty clear cut for me that Russell had to be ahead of Antonelli. I think we have to get out of this mindset that Antonelli's a newcomer who's sort of erratic and up and down and struggling. He's becoming more and more and more powerful. He is the driver we expected him to be, this super fast mega talent. He's on a trajectory now where he's starting to realise that megastar quality. And remember, if you compare it to, say, Max Verstappen, who he's always been compared to, we're at about the point now, race 5 of the season? This is the point where Max Verstappen in his career is winning the Spanish Grand Prix, isn't it, on his promotion to Red Bull. So we have to, I think of Antonelli as a top gun now, and really, really, really quick. Yeah, he's still got a few slightly rougher edges. We saw that. But I think there's a kind of tendency to think, well, if Russell's being bothered by Antonelli, he's underachieving or being useless. But actually, I think this is just one top driver being really pushed hard by another superstar driver who potentially is on a curve that could take him ahead. Very, very possibly. We're yet to see how that plays out. And yes, there were mistakes, but there were mistakes everywhere, as I alluded to, because of the track conditions. And the fact was, they were able to go at it hammer and tongs. They didn't drive into each other and ruin each other's races. So that was good, wasn't it? So I felt like it just felt like really good old school, right on the edge driving. If there hadn't been mistakes kind of almost everywhere throughout the field, probably they would have been beaten to first and second. But yeah, the errors, they were both making it. I was chatting to someone at Mercedes, and they said pretty much all the passes in the race that happened between the two of them were down to an error from the other. So Antonelli made them one out front as well as Russell. And in fact, there's an argument that following rarely, and it's really odd for this to happen, was potentially easier because you were sliding around a bit more, and that helped you a little bit. I mean, I know that's surface temperature, but some of that does go to the bulk temperature of the tyres. That was actually potentially helping you when you were behind to keep the tyres in the window. So a very unusual set of circumstances in this race, and that all fed in to the kind of ordering and the fact that the Mercedes drivers were on top. But I couldn't see any argument. I mean, inexcusable to put Russell first. I don't think so. I don't understand how you could put Antonelli ahead of Russell, because Russell ultimately had the beating of him up until the point where he retired across all of the sessions. You know, potential, great, but Antonelli didn't deliver on that.
Yeah, that's fair. The fight was mega. I feel like if the race, if Russell's car had continued, I'm not sure they would have kept it clean until the end. It felt like we were sat there waiting for a collision, which I'd have been all for. I love entertainment. And I also, you mentioned Antonelli's rough edges there. I think that's going to be really good for those of us who are neutrals, because it's going to make it much harder for Mercedes to manage a teenager who may still have that bit of hot-headedness that we saw a few times over this weekend. But let's talk about Antonelli specifically, because Sidders99 says, not sure I agree with Antonelli being second, saying his sprint race was fairly scrappy, with eagerness bordering on desperation at times. And while he was much better in the race, Russell's retirement made Kimi's mission, there's that word mission again, a lot easier. So Sid is effectively saying there that actually the second half for Kimi was almost a non-event because he had no competition. So the implication here is that maybe second was too high.
Yeah, I mean, I did think about that at times. I was shuffling people around, but I think it comes down to where the other candidates were. Obviously, Hamilton lost a couple of places in the sprint race, and you could say Antonelli lost one place in the sprint race, but Hamilton has, by the same token, kind of lost double the amount. Hamilton qualifying execution, yes, there was a straight line mode thing, but he also made a mistake later in that lap while he's pushing on. So a lot of those candidates, I couldn't quite push ahead of him. There's one driver I'm sure there's a question about later that probably would have been up in the top three, but for one moment. But we'll come back to that later. But that relates to errors. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a reasonable point because my kind of gut feeling around Surly was, oh, should he really be second? But yeah, I think although the sprint race he did get a bit desperate, that was the one time. I liked a lot of the rest of it because I really liked the fact that Antonelli was really willing to put it on the line. I think the sprint race thing at turn one, you can question whether the risk v reward was great, and I don't have a problem with what happened in that incident. I think when you're on the outside, and also the way the dreaded guidelines work, I think it was fair that it wasn't a penalty. The attack after where he had the lock up, that was getting a little bit hot headed, but he gathered it up. So he lost a place in the sprint. But I think overall, because there were a lot of mistakes going on and because of the nature of the battle, that kind of the negative there was kind of counterbalanced a little bit by everything else that he was doing and the fact that these two were going toe to toe so emphatically. Let's now move on to the first of what will be regular features in these podcasts, which is comparing my top 10 to the Race Members Club Champions tier members. Now, there's various tiers in the Race Members Club, and if you're a champion, which is the top tier, you get the chance to vote on what your ranking order is, and then we can compare it to it, and I can tell you why you're all wrong. No, but it's a good way to do a little bit of a comparison. So, Glenn, do you want to let me know what the ranking was?
Yeah, so we're going to compare the top 10 to your top 10. And this is a new feature, relatively new feature that we've added. What I like about it is that, and I'm seeing this in the comments we get from our Champions members, I think it's making people realize how hard it is to do a complete set ranking. It's one thing to pick out one thing you don't like in Edd's ranking and go, why is that guy third? He should be seventh. But when you go, okay, do a 1 to 22 for yourself, people go, oh, this is really hard. So looking at the top 10, the Champions members had Lewis Hamilton at number 1. You had him third. Franco Colapinto was second, while he was only seventh for you. Antonelli, second for you. Third for our members. Verstappen was fourth. Russell, so your number 1, is fifth with the members. Carlos Sainz is sixth, having been eighth for you. Liam Lawson is seventh, having been ninth in your rankings. Arvid Lindblad, eighth for the Champions members, sixth for you. Lando Norris, you had him fourth. The members have him ninth, and Ollie Behrman, 10th for our members and 14th for you. So this is kind of a quick fire reaction, Ed. There's quite a few differences there. What stands out most to you?
Yeah, there's differences. There's nothing kind of massive. There's nothing I look at that and say, my word, that's absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, I think Norris, there's a 5-place difference there. I think Norris was a good example of someone who sort of had an unobtrusively good weekend, in that he had the edge on Piastri. He seemed to have that little edge of confidence on Piastri. It wasn't a huge margin, but just that little bit quicker. And I thought he did pretty well. There was one, I think, brief off in the race as well, but a lot of people had moments like that. And that was just after the first pit stop, I think. So I can understand why Norris maybe sort of wasn't noticed so much. And he started his recovery drive in that race pretty well before retiring. So I think maybe that's just a case of he was quite unobtrusive. Colapinto, there's a 5-place offset there. He went onto the grass and hit the wall. That I've given him a smaller sort of ranking penalty than I would get because he got away with it. But that was a big mistake. And I think had more people seen that, they probably would have factored it in their rankings. But that's not really anybody who's voted in these rankings' fault. So those are the ones that perhaps really leap out at me. And Behrman, 10th versus 14th. I mean, very often you can, particularly in the mid-pack, I feel like in the upper pack, you can kind of argue it's like 1 or 2 places difference. In the mid pack, often it's like sort of plus or minus 4. You can almost argue, given the groupings of the drivers. So those are the main ones that leap out at me. Right, well, we've talked lots about the Mercedes drivers in particular, but I think we've got plenty of others to chat about. Glenn, what have you got next? It looks like it's going a little bit Red Bully now.
Yeah, that's where we're going next. The great thing about these questions is that people pick you up on stuff all over your running order. So we never end up with just a bunch of questions about, say, the top five. But I did want to talk about the Red Bulls next, and we'll start with Max Verstappen. So Chris Wilkins, I quite like this. Chris happily admits to being a Verstappen fan, but asks how Max can only be fifth in your rankings when he was perfect. Perfect is in quote marks. But Chris does say, correct me if I've missed something. Adam B asks how difficult you found it to rank Max, as although he beat his teammate and had two clean races, for most of the weekend it felt like he wasn't extracting everything from the car the way Max normally does. Do you think Max is held to a higher standard because his typical performance is higher than most drivers? Chiv2103 asks if Max would have been number one if he'd held off Lewis Hamilton to claim second at the end. And TMB doesn't understand your suggestion that Verstappen was not really at his best, as he was the only one of the top three not to make any noticeable errors during the race. And being ahead of Hamilton to begin with was down to a great bit of opportunism, and the car just didn't have the pace on mediums that Ferrari did. So a range of questions there, Ed. The theme seems to be, why wasn't Max higher than fifth?
Yeah, I think a big part of it, I mean, fifth's still high, I should say, for a start. I still think that's a very good ranking. But I think he could have beaten Hamilton. If you look at the race pace, I always do some race pace calculations and try and work out baselines for what they were doing. Actually, the Red Bull was probably quick enough to have beaten Hamilton. So again, this is what I mean, not quite at his best. He wasn't completely comfortable with the car, wasn't completely happy with the car. And on weekends like that, he doesn't tend to be able to deliver the levels of pace that we're used to. He's still very good and very quick. I don't think he was perfect, though. I mean, certainly if he'd beaten Hamilton in the Grand Prix, which I think was doable because Hamilton got ahead of him, and that was obviously there was an unfortunate moment in terms of him just running out of energy, and Hamilton went past. But he still had to keep himself ahead. So I sort of thought that in terms of who had a better Grand Prix, Hamilton versus Verstappen, it was very marginally Hamilton. So yeah, I mean, it is difficult with Max. I don't think it's necessarily a higher standard that he's held to, because usually he comes out on top of these rankings ultimately, on average ranking for the past however many years. I think actually ever since we've had them ranked in the order, he's been the top ranked on average. And I suspect, 21, when we were probably still doing numbers rankings, I think he was best on average as well. We had him as a number one. So I don't think he's held to a higher standard. But it just came down to, there was probably a little bit more in the car. Could he have got help work and get the setup direction a little bit better for what they took into the main part of the weekend? Because we give drivers credit for when they do that, and they're part of that. And so if they don't do it, well, there's a little bit of a negative there. So it's all just sort of small negatives. And did struggle a little bit on the medium tyres, but I think there was a way for Verstappen to beat Hamilton, and Verstappen absolutely nailing it would have probably just been able to.
Let's move on to his teammate then, Isaac Hadjar. An eventful weekend, certainly an eventful race. Michael Horner says, if Hadjar was driving a car outside of the top four teams, his needless penalties would have utterly wrecked his race and cost him any points. Therefore, a ranking of 12th seems generous. Ben McBride says, how much did his penalties factored into how you ranked him, but also points out that the second Red Bull being far enough ahead of the midfield to not lose out because of the penalties isn't something we've seen for quite some time. So maybe that could be turned into a positive. Gavin Cameron says Hadjar should be punished more heavily by you for the penalties he picked up. And Stevie Noises says Hadjar is blessed that 20 seconds worth of penalties this year is not as damaging as last year, and says that it's unfair to have him just ahead of Alex Albon, who we're going to talk about later, who had a far better weekend given the circumstances. So Hadjar's penalties there, and whether or not it should have impacted how you ranked him, or how much it impacted how you ranked him, are really the theme around his weekend. How much of a penalty for you was it that he got himself into some hot water with the authorities?
Yeah, it did cost him in rankings. So I thought Hadjar on pace had a pretty reasonable weekend overall. So I was quite sort of impressed with him. He wasn't far off Verstappen in the two qualifying sessions, and there were moments when he looked like he might even be able to beat him. Certainly, I think Hadjar felt he could have had the pace to beat him in main qualifying. So there was a little bit of that in there. I think the moving across on Leclerc thing was an honest mistake penalty, which, while it doesn't excuse it, that helps a little bit. So it's one of those things that it did hurt him, because I think he'd have been up, well into the top 10 without that. But that said, I think if anyone looking at it saying that they've penalised him more for those penalties, I think I'd have understood it and accepted it. I think that would be perfectly reasonable. So it's one of those things. It's a very inexact science how much of a negative you take for somebody who's performing well for those sorts of things. And you can also argue that he also knew the sort of position he was in the race in terms of the level of how risky he could be in terms of what he was doing. So maybe there was a little bit of a generosity for that. But yeah, I think it's fair to somebody like Albon, who we'll talk about later. It is hard to give them a fair crack of the whip, because almost they haven't had the opportunity.
Let's move on to a question about Charles Leclerc, who ended up 11th in your rankings. Curtis feels that is a bit high, saying he finished over 30 seconds behind Hamilton and was quite critical of his own performance. While Russ Taylor says it would have been quite easy to bomb Charles down the list, but I'll take halfway on a difficult weekend. So I assume Russ is a Charles Leclerc fan. And then Russ adds that he was catching Lewis in the GP, then lost contact, but kept Hadjar behind well. So how difficult was it to judge Leclerc's weekend? We're not really used to seeing him finishing a long way behind Lewis Hamilton, are we?
Yeah, he did struggle a bit, but I think Leclerc's declaration of it being his worst Ferrari weekend or something, I don't think it was, because if you look at qualifying, he was about a 10th off Hamilton. That's not where he wants to be, but he was just under a 10th in sprint qualifying. I think just over a 10th in main qualifying. So that wasn't terrible, was it? I mean, yes, you could say Hamilton in main qualifying didn't maximise, but I think given Leclerc was really struggling on the brakes, I think it was a weekend where he sort of did a good job of just limiting the damage and battling on. And I don't think he was as dreadful as he thought he was. He wasn't crashing at Parabolica or binning it while leading at Paul Ricard or any of those things, was he? Or crashing in the castle section at Azerbaijan. So I thought I will give a certain amount of credit to kind of a good sort of damage limitation when you're struggling weekend. But I actually think Leclerc will have made his ranking feel more generous by how negative he was about his own performance, because he was just never, ever comfortable. But I think actually in the cold light of day, I think even if he went over it and looked at it, he'd probably think actually it probably isn't the absolute worst he's had. But I think when you get a driver who's just not comfortable and just didn't feel he could do what he could do, it will feel much worse, because that's a place they don't want to be. But I think in terms of objective performance, he was okay. He wasn't brilliant, but it was all right. Now we'll move on to the second of our regular features, where I give the co-host for the particular episode, which you'll be pleased to know is you, Glenn Freeman, if you haven't caught that with that,
I'd work
has
that
the
out.
chance to ask me either what the hell were you thinking, or oh, that interested me, or that was a good idea. What are you going to go with? Are you going to go with positive or negative?
I'm going to go positive. I'm not sure how. It'll be interesting to see as we rotate the people that join you for this task, if there is a trend of people leaning more positively or negatively. But yeah, the idea is kind of to pick up on something that maybe didn't get a load of input from our members, but something else that the person on the other side of the screen to Ed would like to just highlight briefly. And I'm going for Sergio Perez, who, not for the first time, it must be said, made it into your top 10. I'll admit, I have a little fascination with the Cadillacs in that in the early laps of the race or during Q1, I always look to see if they're ahead of anybody, primarily the Aston Martins. Obviously, Perez took that to extremes, particularly in the sprint race. So it had been in my mind during the weekend of going, what on earth is a Cadillac doing there on the timing tower? So I was pleased to see him rewarded with a top 10 from you as well.
Yeah, I think he's been in the top 10 the last 3 races, so he's having a really, really good season, actually. Clearly the quicker Cadillac driver at the moment. Cadillac's a little bit tricky because they're still a new team. It's only their 5th race weekend, so they're still rough around the edges, and there are still times when comparing the performance across the two cars is a little bit tricky. They still have moments where the deployment goes a little bit weird and everything. But no, I thought Perez did a really good job, and he was doing what he could in terms of battling a little bit higher than perhaps he should be. Obviously, 11th on the road in the sprint race was good. I didn't give him a massive sort of penalty for the fact he got a penalty in the sprint race that cost him, because I kind of understood that he had to be a little bit robust in defence. That did hurt him a tiny bit, because he could easily have been higher. He could have been in the top six. So yeah, Perez having a cracking season, and it's good to see that he's been able to come back after the Red Bull opportunity kind of turned to a nightmare in the end, and just remind everyone that he's a very, very capable and good Grand Prix driver. Right, well, we've talked about a lot of the front-running drivers, Glenn, but I imagine you've got some questions teed up for some of those a little bit further down the field.
Yeah, so we'll do a little bit of any other business, and then we're going to come to the McLaren drivers, because there were lots of questions about the way their weekend ended primarily. So let's start with a couple other things that piqued my interest down the order. I mentioned we were going to come to Alex Albon. Let's do that now. Luke Sherman says, "How difficult was it to rate Albon, who you put 13th, given how many incidents affected his weekend? I felt like I had a hard time getting a read on his actual performance."
Yeah, and I think Alex Albon thought the same. I asked him after the race about just how frustrating the whole thing's been, because he's had loads of bad luck this year. He's basically had one race that's gone sort of pretty decently, where he got in the points in Miami, but he's had so much misfortune, obviously starting with hitting that groundhog and ending up in the wall. So yeah, it was very, very difficult to get a read on his performance. I think qualifying probably still could have been a bit better. The race actually, he was going quite well and it was looking quite promising. But then again, he gets torpedoed by Piastri. So I would say sometimes you get weekends where people show their performance, but they're unfortunate and they can get a decent ranking. Like Lindblad obviously didn't start the Grand Prix, but he'd had the opportunity to show what he could do throughout the weekend up to that. Whereas Albon almost never got off the starting line. So in that regard, 13th does actually feel quite harsh as well. But I think his was an external denial of opportunity to climb higher rather than anything else. But yeah, I don't think you got a fair reading at all on where Albon was this weekend. And actually, that's been the case for him for a pretty significant chunk of the season.
Right, the next one comes from TMB, who says that Colapinto should have been number one. Franco is seventh in your ranking, Ed, but should have been number one given he missed practice and still had teammate Gasly's number all weekend. And TMB adds, can't see how he could have got more out of the weekend. And although Colapinto did make a mistake in the race, so did your top three of Russell, Antonelli, and Hamilton.
Yeah, and it all comes down to that moment, as I referred to earlier. If you haven't seen it, go and check it out, because it was a big error. Put it this way: if, as could very easily have happened, he had that, and the suspension gets damaged and he's out, then there'd be loads of people mocking him for a stupid error, because it was an unnecessary error, especially as it was under VSC as well. So I think if it hadn't been for that, then there's actually a very strong chance he would have been number one. And I can't imagine he wouldn't have been in the top three, because he had a really strong weekend, did comprehensively outperform Gasly. And this is the Colapinto that we've seen hints of in the past. And it's great to see him. There's two consecutive really strong weekends. And if he keeps doing this, he's going to get a number one soon enough, isn't he? I think he was second in Miami. And yeah, there was just a drop here for that mistake. But it was more significant than these other errors that are referred to. So if you haven't seen it, do have a look, because I think if you listen to his radio comms after, he thought he'd probably done some damage, and he was actually quite surprised he got away with it. So yeah, there was that one big slice of luck, but otherwise a brilliant weekend. And it's the thing to remember, that you can have a really impressive weekend and still end up a bit down the rankings, because there's something like that happens. And yeah, without that, Colapinto is 100%. He's a driver rankings podium, and maybe he's P1.
Yeah, it feels like he's building some momentum at the moment. So I'm sure we'll be talking about him plenty in the upcoming Q&As that we do. But let's finish then with the McLarens. They were a big story, particularly on race day. Norris, to remind everybody, was fourth. Oscar Piastri 21st after his clumsy accident. But we'll start with Norris. Matthew Edwards says, I'm surprised to see Lando at number 4, considering the choice to start on Inters. That was a huge mistake. Andrea Hanna says, did Lando's part in the tyre choice count more than the driving mistakes made by the Mercedes drivers and Hamilton? I think there is an argument he made the least driving mistakes over the weekend and therefore should be higher. And Melmot Harko says Norris is way too high. Melmot was at the race and says it was extremely obvious from the hairpin grandstand before the start that slicks were the only choice as the track was bone dry. So surely such a catastrophic blunder should crater his ranking.
Well, in terms of the tyres, having listened to a lot of the radio, I don't think Norris was especially on board with it. So overall, that was a team decision. And even once the race started, he was sort of pushing to come in, and they were even talking about leaving him out another lap. But uh, you can argue he could have pushed back a little bit harder. But I think the team didn't make life easy for him there. I'm not sure either that they even tried intermediates on the lap to the grid either, so didn't have the full data set either. I mean, what were there? 6, 7 cars went on intermediates, so there was a reason for them making that decision. I don't think it was the right reason, but I actually didn't hold that decision against them a great deal, because I think first and foremost that was a team driven one, whereas you did have a case Sainz was very much his decision in terms of what he did. So, yeah, but actually the pace was strong in the race. He was driving well, and all weekend actually was good. There was a mistake. I was just checking in the early laps when he had an off at the chicane while chasing Albon. But a lot of people were having errors at that point as well, just a straight line moment. So it was one of those little stealth mistakes that happened. And without that might have helped him be a little bit higher. But no, I thought he was good. And I didn't hold the starting time mistake against him too much, because remember, it's the usual thing of the team was also thinking, oh, well, there could be some rain as well. So there's an element of not holding that too much against him. So I thought he had a good weekend. And actually, if you look at Norris versus Piastri and you shift that into, say, a McLaren that's right at the front and they're fighting for the championship, we'd all be saying, "Oh, Norris is doing a great job. He's taken a step with the assuredness of winning the world championship." So overall, and obviously this is purely a ranking of this weekend, but overall, I think he's having a good season.
Let's talk about Piastri then. 21st out of the 22 drivers. Jake Britton says it's harsh on Piastri to put him that low, considering it wasn't his error that had him fighting through the midfield in the first place. So Jake there blaming the team for the tyre error that dropped Piastri back. But Chris Campbell asks, how is Piastri not last? The move which took out Albon should be an automatic 22nd. Now, I will say, Ed, I mentioned earlier that when I'm watching the race, I do sort of think of moments that I think are going to influence your rankings. I was kind of similar to Chris here, and when I saw how rubbish that shunt was, obviously he was trying to overtake, was it the Haas car that was behind? When I saw that, I thought, oh, there we go. That's the kind of error that puts you at the bottom of Ed's rankings. So I guess this is perhaps also a chance to maybe explain why Nico Hulkenberg ended up last as well, instead of Oscar Piastri.
Yeah, well, Piastri's error was very cack-handed and stupid, and you need to factor in when you're at risk of having a lock up in a pass if there's a car ahead. I always find that overtaking one car and then clatter into another car at a very slow corner ahead quite it's a little bit tunnel vision move. It wasn't deliberate by Piastri or anything. A mistake happened.
It's
I
a club
understand
racing
why.
mistake, though, isn't
Exactly,
it?
yeah. So he's not suddenly a buffoon idiot driver because of it. But yeah, that mistake was bigger than any single mistake Hulkenberg made. The trouble was that Hulkenberg had an aggregation of mistakes. The dropping the wheel on the grass, that's a fairly stupid error, and having the spin in the race. He had a corner cut in the sprint race that led to a penalty that cost him 3 positions, 4 positions, or something like that. So basically, Hulkenberg had a series of errors, even though he was quite quick, that drops him out, because both of these drivers were fast and would have had pretty good rankings, because Hulkenberg was marginally quicker than Bortoletto. Piastri was marginally slower than Norris, but not by a gargantuan margin. So I just felt it was that one single moment for Piastri that really cost him. And yeah, it wasn't his fault. He was fighting through the midfield. But once you're there, nobody made that error other than him. It's just that would have put him 22nd had Hulkenberg not made more errors. But it's a classic case here of where you've got a couple of drivers who made either one big error or an aggregation of errors that puts them behind what I'd sort of call the slow coach drivers of the weekend, the kind of Bottas's and the Strolls, who were just doing very little. But I always think the first thing to do is not clatter into something hard and or bin it or that kind of thing. So I felt that Hulkenberg and Piastri both undercut their weekend with a good performance, just with a silly error, because Piastri should absolutely have salvaged points from the race from that situation.
Yep, pretty rubbish and deserves to put you down the bottom, I think. We'll see that as a pattern as we do these through the season. We're going to finish then with our final regular piece that we'll keep coming back to in these Q&As, which is looking at our championship standings that we create from these rankings. So what we do is we take Ed's the top 10 from Ed's list each time and apply the F1 point system. And then F1 Visualized, who we work with on social media, creates a lovely graphic for us, which if you're watching the video version of this, you'll be able to see on screen. Ed, we won't go through each driver on here, but to give people a rough idea of how the point standings are shaping up in your world, it's a Mercedes 1-2 here as well, with Antonelli 3 points ahead of Russell. Then there's a 10-point drop to Lewis Hamilton in third. And right behind him, we've got Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz. So they're our top five. Then there's a little drop again to Arvid Lindblad and Charles Leclerc, who are tied on 35 points. And then it's Gasly, Behrman, and Piastri, which I think is our top 10. Ed, I know in the past you've tried not to look at this graphic because you don't want it to influence your thinking as the season goes on. So once again, we're putting you outside of your comfort zone by making you look at this. I've got something that stands out to me that I'll mention in a moment. But how do you feel that your Edd Straw Driver Rankings Championship is shaping up? What do you make of the standings so far?
It's still quite disordered because it's a small sample set, I would say. I mean, obviously, the fact that Antonelli and Russell are first and second is interesting, given they've only had one P1 between them, and obviously that is a factor. Hamilton third's interesting, actually. The fact that he's having a pretty decent season. I mean, it's clear he was having one. Sainz, the standout midfield driver from that pack's interesting. So yeah, there's a few little trends there. I mean, obviously, given it's a points-based thing based on the top 10, there's a bit of a shuffle in the order compared to, say, if you do certain other types of averages that factor everything in. But I'll say it's very, very early days. And if you look at it, Hadjar down in 20th place, he's not been the 20th best driver this season. He's been much more impressive than that. But equally, Hadjar's found ways to not get a great ranking on a weekend where he's been pretty impressive. So it's always worth bearing in mind the elements that lead to this slightly disordered ranking at this stage of the season in particular. But yeah, it's interesting to see it.
Well, you mentioned Hadjar there. The one I was going to pick out was Max Verstappen, who's 12th in your standings with just 19 points. And, this, were we to make Ed do a rank all the drivers for the season so far, it would not look like this, because there's weekends where if you end up 11th to 22nd, you all get 0. So it's not really a fair reflection. I mean, looking at Max, yes, he had a 21st in Miami, but he had a 10th in China and an 11th in Japan. So that's 2 races where he did okay, and he's only got 1 point to show for it in the rankings that we've got here. I mean, Ed, I suspect that as we do these over the coming races, Max is probably going to move up that order, isn't he?
Oh, no doubt. He'll be up near the top by the end of the season, I'm sure, because he's Max Verstappen and he is the best driver in Formula One ultimately. But it's a reminder of, well, one, particularly when it's a small sample set. Obviously, Miami, his ranking was tanked based on one big error on a weekend where he was pretty good. So without that error, he's probably got another 20 points in this, and he's up there in 6, and it doesn't look so bizarre. So it's worth bearing that in mind. And also just the fact that because the standard of drivers in Formula One is so high, it's very, very hard, even if you're the best driver in Formula One, to kind of go P1, P1, P1. But that just doesn't happen. I'll look for future episodes. I'll have a look back at the historic rankings and see kind of how many P1s you'll get in a good season. And Verstappen, even in some of his sort of most mega seasons, there'd still only be a small number of P1s overall, because it's really, really hard to get a P1 and deliver it consistently. So yeah, I think it tells you more about how tricky it's been for Red Bull, and Red Bull have not hit the mark with the car. And we know Verstappen struggles to do what he does when the car is a little bit limited, and that there's kind of a ceiling put on what he can do. It's not really him not exploiting what the car can do. But if you don't produce a car that has that kind of sharpness and the rear instability that allows him to do what other drivers can't do, and you've got to put a lid on him and you contain him. And there's an element of lack of opportunity here to actually show how brilliant he is and get those P1, P2, P3s that he will rack up. But I'd be staggered if he's not top 3, if not top 1, come the end of the year. But again, the reason I try not to look at these is I don't want it to influence me, and that because it's points, I can kind of deal with it, because it's a slightly like you say, it cuts off the bottom 12 drivers, if you like, only given weekend, and there's a big difference between a P11 and a P22, should we say. So interesting, and just tells you Red Bull is just not a very happy place in terms of where the car is at the moment, but he'll climb, no question whatsoever.
And poor Valtteri Bottas, before we finish, the only driver yet to have appeared in a top 10 for you. So he's the only driver stuck on 0 points. And to be honest, just having a quick look at the numbers, Valtteri's not been that close. He's had a 12th, which he got in China, but the rest of the time he's been nowhere near the points, sadly. So if that doesn't call for a Valtteri Bottas sympathy corner, I don't know what does.
Yeah, if Bottas wants to make his return with Cadillac worthwhile, he needs to start getting some top tens, because the Cadillac's quick enough to catch the eye, as Perez has shown, and Perez is trending in the right direction, because in the early races he wasn't able to make such a good impression because there were all sorts of problems as well. And what I always look for is drivers who are kind of consistently delivering at a good level. And that's where you really see the Verstappens, the Alonsos, the Russells, the Norrises, the Leclercs, the Hamiltons sort of historically, and maybe that's back now again for Hamilton this season. That's where you see them really stand out, because you get the kind of what you call the sort of more midfieldery drivers can often have, like, their best 5 weekends will be every bit as good as what Verstappen comes up with. But Verstappen's 13th best weekend will be way better than their 13th best weekend. So you kind of create a curve that way. So yeah, very interesting to track that, and interesting to hear what members of the Race Members Club think about it all as well. And if you want to join the Race Members Club, hit the link in the episode description, or head to Patreon and search for the Race or the Race Members Club. Like I say, if you want to vote in the rankings bit that we get from members, that's Champions tier, but there's various different tiers. You can read more about what you get, and it's not just the chance to ask questions in our driver rankings Q&A. You also get to ask questions in our post-race review episodes. Loads of extra content. It's a thriving community full of great people. And the thing I always say is, what I really want to do is foster kind of good debate. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing with me and forcefully making your point, but I try and say to everyone, let's try and have a proper good debate, and understand that people can disagree on things. You can think for certain reasons a driver should be lower ranked or higher ranked, and actually, if that's your methodology, that's absolutely fine. And the interest is in who has different methodologies. I know I'm harsher on mistakes maybe than some people are, but everybody's got their own methodology and their way of looking at things, and that's the thing to think about. And hopefully that the debate will help everybody understand what everybody's thinking, and most importantly, understand what these drivers are doing, because that's endlessly fascinating. Even in this season, where I would say generally it's been the most frustrating for rating and ranking drivers, which is something I've done for a very, very long time, because of the fairly random interjections of the power unit characteristics, and the fact a mistake can sometimes yield lap time, which is really not what it should be. And that's why I'm keen for them to keep pushing on with progressing the rules. But it's made the driver performance signal, I would say, the weakest it's ever been in Formula One by some margin. I've always been a keen defender of that. People have always said, oh, it's all about the car, but the car's always been significant. But the driver was very significant in terms of both raising the potential ceiling of the car and extracting that potential. But this power unit thing, that's created a chaotic element that's going through these weekends, particularly on tracks that are energy poor, like Canada, actually quite frustrating and not a little bit concerning.